On this episode of Rock School Proprietor Podcast, Mandy and I speak with Michael Hemsworth of New Song School of Music in Elk Grove, California, and author of Mr. Michael's Music Maker Manual, A Parent's Guide to Growing Creative Children. We talk a lot about music, parent education, even neuroscience in this episode, so we get pretty deep. Michael's got decades of experience in the music teaching space, and his studios see over 1,300 students every week. So there's a ton of great insight from him on this episode. Stay tuned. Welcome to Rock School Proprietor Podcast. My name's John Kozicki.
And I'm Mandy York.
Mandy, we've got another guest that we're going to talk to today, Michael Hemsworth. Michael, how you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Michael, you are the founder of New Song School of Music in California. 4 locations, is that correct?
We do. We have 4 now.
Wow. And you are the author of Mr. Michael's Music Maker Manual, A Parent's Guide to Growing Creative Children. And that's what we're going to be talking about is your book today, and I'm excited about that. You just released this book very recently, correct?
Yes, I think we're in maybe week 2.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So very fresh, very fresh.
Yes.
As far as your background or your work at New Songs, is there anything specific that I think might be interesting or important to share to frame the context of the conversation about your book?
Sure. I mean, I've literally done this my whole life. I started teaching when I was 16 years old, and that's been my real job for the whole time. So I've been working for 25 years with parents, and a big part of this for me was trying to communicate, having worked with literally thousands and thousands and thousands of parents, what do I know? What do I see when I'm working with kids that maybe not everybody else gets to understand is really happening, and without getting deep into all of the research and the academics, pull back the curtain a little bit and understand some of really the magic that we're doing, because it's happening every day in our classes. But I don't always know that the average parent realizes what they're really giving their kids when they're showing up to class.
Yes, I love that. I really enjoyed reading your book, Michael. And it's something that I've been thinking about for 10 years since I opened my studio. Really, I'm early childhood music, so caregivers are in the studio space with me as I'm working with the young kids. And I have found over the years how incredibly important it is to be educating the parents. And I love that this book is it's directed towards them. Gosh, you have a lot of experience. You've been doing this a long time. So it is great that you put this down to share with all of us. I love that. Yeah.
I joke that I've kind of come the full circle because, I've kind of just been wrapping up my last high schooler because I was a piano major, I've taught piano lessons historically through this one. And so I've kind of seen them all the way up. And at this point, my average day is all early childhood education as well too. So it's I got rid of all of the kids that stayed with me for 10 years or so, and now I'm just back with 6-year-olds again.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's really cool. I think about too, in my classroom, you have children, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, and I have 2 girls, and sometimes I refer to them as my guinea pigs too, because not only am I, in the classroom, in the studio and teaching parents and working with the kids, but then I have my own little lab at home, seeing how these things work at home.
Right.
In my world, and I'm interested because you say you're teaching these early ones now. I focus a lot on caregivers participating in the music making with the kids too. And your book is explaining to parents how to successfully support and cultivate, right? Your gardener references or metaphor is really great. I always like expressing to the parents how important it is that they are kind of part of the music experience in that early childhood phase, at least too. Is that something you ever talk about with your parents, or what kind of classes are you doing right now? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So we have a pretty big range of early childhood classes, and it's kind of nice, and because we are a larger studio, there's we can make some more connections. A lot of times people that are really great with early childhood programs just do early childhood programs. And of course, we have a place where we can graduate them up and, we can kind of see them through the next stages and phases. But yes, like talking with parents is a huge, portion of that. And I think also just really giving parents permission to be the involved ones. That a lot of parents I find just like sort of self-deprecate and be like, well, I'm not very musical, so like let me just hand them off to you to do something. And I think that that's not really the case. It's like, maybe you don't like classical music. That's fine. My wife doesn't like classical music. My kids turned out just fine. It's not like there's just this one pathway in. And so if you engage with music, you're a musical person, whether or not you feel like you got all this formal training or that you have this professional background or not.
Yeah. I find that as a big hurdle in the beginning too with parents, because they just say the same thing, I'm not musical. And that's a little bit of a pet peeve, because I like to tell everyone that really we're musical beings. It's kind of innate. It's in us. And, if you don't cultivate it, like you say, it's just not, it doesn't blossom. Right. So like we read to our kids, and I think you mentioned this in the book too, we read to our kids because we want them to be readers. Right. We know that it's good for them. If we sing to our kids, if we make music with our kids, they'll know that music is for them. It's part of the human experience, and they'll want to join in as well. If we're not modeling for them, then they're not going to catch on to that. I love to tell my parents too that you just can't teach them to sing out of tune. You can't. You're not going to teach them to sing out of tune. But if you sing out of tune every day, just go for it. Make a joyful noise. Then they know that it's for them. And that's going to, I suppose, plant those seeds.
Yeah. It's that permission to be creative, that,
yes.
That nobody gets to say, well, I'm just not a creative person, because that's, I think, just such a popularly held belief. But so it holds so many people back from not just being musical, but just so many things they might want to do with that knowledge that they can be a creative person.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, actually, both of you are mentioning a lot of terms that, Michael, are in the book. Cultivating the garden, permission to be creative. Those are, all those things are in your book. Now, Michael, you wrote the book specifically for parents as the audience, correct?
I did.
Now, I think, and Mandy, we've talked about parents are kind of the real students in music lessons, quote unquote, real, right? I think episode 2 of this podcast, we had a long discussion about that. But the audience for this podcast and for this discussion probably are going to be more music instructors, studio owners. I do think it's important that we have this discussion about the parents. So I guess what I'm saying is, you might not sell books to parents based on this appearance on the podcast, but I think this is so crucial to what we do as music instructors, so that we understand the mindset of the parent, because we have a different perspective, because we've been working in music education for so long. We have to kind of look at things from the parent's perspective and understand where these things that we inherently know, those are the things that they might not even be thinking about. And if I'm understanding, Michael, you correctly, that's kind of the whole goal of your book, correct?
Yeah. And I mean, and from a teacher perspective, I also think we should not be judgmental of parents. I mean, I think sometimes it's really easy as the teacher to then look down on parents, and that's so counterproductive as well too. I mean, they truly don't know what they don't know. And a lot of people have been told somewhere, talking about pet peeves as you were, mine is, every adult that's been like, well, this person told me, like I took band in 4th grade and they told me, well, maybe you should take, soccer. Or I sang in the choir when I was 14 and they told me, well, maybe you should, volunteer over there. And those things are so damaging and pretty much not true. I also think that in most of those cases, people have experienced a teacher that had one pathway. You can talk about this multiple pathways in, and they said, okay, like there's one ladder up to being good musically, and like you're not on it. And so then they just said, sorry, bye. And that's, then gets replicated. And I think that as a parent, we all really do want what's best for our kids. We're not trying to mess them up, but we need that permission to say that, you can participate, that it's okay, and you can keep trying, and you don't have to give up because the first thing didn't work out.
Yeah. And to help them understand what the journey looks like. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we've talked about this before. I think it's mentioned in the book too, like, well, they're just doodling on one song all the time, or I don't see enough progress. That's part of this parent education piece too, is letting them know what the journey looks like. They have preconceived notions that they, like you said, they don't know what they don't know.
And I think as teachers, we have to understand those definitions of progress as well, too. I come primarily from a more classical traditional background. Like I got a degree in piano. So, like I don't come from the rock world. I have zero like cool vibes. I say that in the book, like I'm decidedly nerdy and I never had a chance of being a cool dad. But that's okay, too. But that we kind of get locked into a box of one way that's going to work. And we have to be more open-minded to say, okay, if I'm trying to teach you this piece of sheet music and it took us 3 months, that's not on you, the child. That's, that's back on me as a teacher to look at how many tools do I have in my toolbox and how much do I understand the different ways. I came from a very visual learning world. And so 20 years ago, I didn't know how to teach kids songs by ear. I was freaked out about playing a song by ear. Like I didn't teach kids to play songs that they memorized. Like I knew how to work on a book. And so if you didn't work well in a book, I didn't know what to do with you necessarily. And that's been a big part of my own evolution as well, too, is that, okay, books are great. And these other tools are, like it's not either or.
Mm-hmm. It sounds very much like, and Mandy, you mentioned the concept of cultivating the garden. And Michael, that's a concept that you use kind of throughout the book. And in particular, with that concept of cultivating the garden, you talk about kind of two archetypes of parents. You've got the carpenter parent and the gardener parent. Can you expand a little bit from your writing in the book on that idea of cultivating the garden? Because it sounds like what you were just talking about is very similar. Like maybe there isn't just one path, right? Or one plan. And the difference between the carpenter parent and the gardener parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not my analogy. I didn't create this analogy. I just feel like it rung very true and wanted to apply it a lot into what we're doing with music and arts and creativity. And I kind of have one of both parents. And I like to give both my parents credit because one of the things that my parents did very, very right is gave a lot of permission to be creative. Like both of my parents gave me a wide, pathway. And if I said I wanted to be a ventriloquist as a kid, they're like, cool, do your thing, dude. So I never felt like, some sort of creative venture was off limits or less than or bad. So there was always that level of permission, which I think, stood with me. But intrinsically, like I have one parent that was a carpenter, that kind of idea that, okay, give me the instruction manual because I want to get my kids, turned out properly at the end of it. Mm-hmm. And one that was kind of like, well, let's just see where this goes. Yeah. And so I definitely experienced both of those things as well too, and reflected on it a lot in my life as well too. But I have 3 kids, and they are mostly grown at this point. I have this month I have one high school graduate, one college graduate, and you know what? They all turned out really, really different. But I like all of them very, very much, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And that concept of the gardener parent as just sort of, well, let's see how this works out versus the carpenter parent, which has a firm plan. You do these steps and you get this result. As it relates to the parents that we see in our lesson studios, I see that and like everything in between. And I'm sure both of you can see that too. And I think it is very much, at least what I see in my studio, those carpenter parents or those that have, maybe lean more towards that side of that spectrum, where I might have to have these conversations about, well, really what is learning music about? What is this process about? If you think that plan A or point A to point B is how this is going to work, we might not be the right studio for you. I mean, I'm sure there might be instructors like that. Mandy and Michael, I'm assuming you've seen similarities in parents in your studios. Yes?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when they lean towards that carpenter side, it's very like, what should they be doing? Is this okay? And I feel
how many minutes,
in my
minutes should they practice, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm. In my setting, it, is very parent focused, and I feel like I have to get them to release a little bit and calm. And we're learning through play here. It's okay if they're not doing exactly what we're doing. We've talked about this before, John. In my classes, watching is participating, right? Mm-hmm. Experimenting with an instrument in a way that is different than I am playing is participating. So even with a 1-year-old, you've got those parents that lean that way. And, guys, I think that this is why having early childhood programs in your studios is such a great thing, because you're cultivating these parents and these kids from an early age, and they've got a place to go, when they head to your studios, to the private lessons, to the bands. They have these really strong backgrounds, and these early childhood programs can build, just really rich studio cultures, right?
Yeah. I have a student that I've worked with, I think, for about 8 years now, and he's on the spectrum, and I reference him in the book as well too. And he has been such an evolution for me as a teacher working with him, because he is nothing like me, basically. Like he doesn't read, he doesn't read music. He's not, he can to some extent at this point, but I mean, like, he is wired kind of the exact opposite that I'm naturally wired. And so being able to fully get inside of his world instead of trying to bring him into my world has been such a rich experience for me as a teacher. And to be able to, and he was definitely one as a 3-year-old that didn't do anything in class that you might say is like behaving successfully or doing the thing. He would definitely be the one that we're, playing this on the bells, and he's just not, mm-hmm. But his mom was always so deeply involved and entrenched in the process and such a great communicator. So she would send me videos during the week, because then he'd go home and he'd play everything we did in class. Stuff he had never, ever done in front of me. It was all locked in there. And this was, he was a 3-4-year-old student, has special needs. And so you just had to know that what it looked like on the surface, in class, you'd look and say, well, this is a failure. It was actually just a tremendous success. Mm-hmm. And, then I followed this journey with him, and we're playing the piano. And again, he comes in his own musical world. And it's my challenge to come to him instead of ask him to come to me and say, okay, well, you watched Cinderella all week. So doesn't matter what I had planned. We're playing Cinderella today. And that means, okay, what can I attach to this song? We're going to learn what scale it's in. We're going to learn how to use a chord. We're going to learn how to use 5 fingers instead of 2 fingers. But to attach onto what he was doing has been such a challenge, but such great expanding place for me as a teacher as well too.
I'm so glad that you just shared that. So, because one of my questions was going to be about, I guess, how you take what you learn as a parent and bring that into the lesson room and the studio. And in particular, my son is neurodivergent. And when I started to understand and observe how he learns and how he understands things differently, that completely changed how I approach teaching. That completely changed how I approach things in my studio, because what it allowed me to see was exactly what you just said, Michael. And this is not exclusive to, neurodivergent kids, but every kid is going to come to our studio and to lessons with their own way of learning, their own desires to learn. And if we don't accommodate them in that respect, like, we have to figure out, well, what is going to be best for them and how are they going to learn? What techniques do they respond to? Are they a visual learner? Are they an auditory learner? What style of learning are we talking about? If we don't recognize that, well, then it's not going to be a fulfilling experience for anyone. So I guess that you also mentioned in the book, your own son, one of your kids has an auditory processing issue. And how much has that influenced what you're talking about in the book, what you're doing in your studio?
Yes, my son's name is Gideon, and he has auditory processing disorder, which was in and of itself an interesting challenge to figure out. My wife is a great individualizer and really helps recognize a lot of those things. And so she did a great job when he was a young child of, instead of going with, well, he's misbehaving or he has ADHD, like we had his hearing tested 3 times, she really did the digging to find that. But the funny thing is, as we went along, the vowels that his brain has the hardest time processing is I, E, and O. We'd known that when we named him Gideon, which literally contains all of the sounds that he can't hear. Sometimes that's life, and
Yeah.
he's obviously doing a lot better. It's great having so much individualized support. He's graduating a year early from high school, but it's been such a great challenge to recognize that, as a second child and as a very, very different learning style than me, being able to slow down and be patient and realize, okay, just because it makes sense to me does not mean it's going to make sense to you, right down to the level of the way that things get into your brain, and being patient with that and being, like, honestly, just a good listener, and to say, okay, how does the world potentially sound and feel and hear to you? Because it might not be the same as the way that it sounds and feels to me. And so slowing down and trying to get that perspective, I think, has been a huge part about being a better teacher as well, too.
These are things that, obviously, I mentioned I learned some of these things from being a parent. I know, Mandy, you alluded to, like, your own kids being kind of the guinea pigs and
Mm-hmm.
helping you to be a better teacher. Obviously, Michael, your story represents your personal life influencing your professional life. Now, not all music instructors are also parents.
Mm-hmm.
And those who are, not all of them maybe have these types of experiences. Michael, how do you share this knowledge that comes from your personal life but influences how you teach? How do you share that with your staff and your instructors?
Yeah, that's such a great challenge. And it's honestly an ongoing challenge, because we run into our own biases and our own, what worked for me so easily, that I think we have to talk a lot about how to get outside that. We have a couple of core values at our studio, and one of those is curiosity, which I think applies to creativity, but it also just applies to everything that we do. We have to be curious and say, okay, if they're not practicing, let's not jump to, they're not bad, they're not good, or let's jump to what are a myriad of things that could be preventing them from doing this. Are we giving them stuff that they legitimately would ever want to practice, or are we just expecting that this is the way it is and you have to do this first? I feel this way coming from the classical background about scales. I talk about this a lot. There's a certain school of thought, like, well, you have to learn all of your scales, first, and then you can do the fun other stuff. And I just think, how much sense does that make to a 7-year-old to say, you know what, you just got to do all this stuff that none of us like, but everybody has to do it. before you
Yeah.
could do any of the good stuff. It's just kind of a backwards philosophy, as opposed to, igniting the love of that learning, and really the belief in students that you're going to be able to be good at this. That sense of one of the motivational strategies we're talking about is giving students autonomy and competence and relatedness, which again it's not my science, not my philosophy, but talking about how to get it into our music experience and giving them competence, saying, I'm going to send you with stuff that you actually feel like you can be good at, versus I'm going to give you a whole bunch of stuff that you're not good at right now, is quite the flip sometimes for us, and to build on the confidence that we're giving them instead of constantly just only giving them challenges.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the context of, I think the example you used was a 7-year-old student. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, these students, they don't necessarily even know how to advocate for themselves in terms of what they want to learn, what they feel like they should be learning. They're just kind of in this groove where, like, okay, this adult is telling me I need to do this, and so I guess that's what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side of that is, if you use an adult student as an example, I can't tell you how many times adult students have walked into my studio and simply said, yeah, I just want to learn how to play some songs. And we take that at face value because they're literally telling us, this is what I want to do. We're not trying to force them into like playing scales and like all this other stuff. We're saying, like, this is the problem that they're having, and they want us to solve for them. So let's do it. And we don't even question it. But it's interesting that when it comes to the younger students, again, who don't necessarily have that voice to say that, we don't even consider trying to figure out what it is that they do want to do.
Right. And I really evolve with this over time as well, too, because I think we're opening a lot of doors for our students. I teach a lot of kind of folk music now with our early childhood program that I historically wouldn't have done. And no kid comes in and usually identifies, like, I want to play folk songs. It's not part of their vocabulary right now, but there's an experience there that they can have as well too, taking something that is easy and manageable. I guess the best analogy is, how many friends and neighbors, kids and things have sat down and said, I can play piano, and they play Mary Had Little Lamb. And then, like, that's it. They now, that's the one thing that they've learned. But there's a lot of things like that we can hand off to students, and they might not already come in knowing this song, but it's well within their skill set. And so we can kind of pull back, and that's when it's fun. This is fun not just because I already knew it, but it's fun because I can be successful doing it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Translation, they feel successful at it. It makes them want to do it some more. It makes them feel like, yes, I did this. I'm ready to learn more about doing this. I love that. You mentioned folk music, and that made me think about, in your book, you break down music into 3 broad categories: popular, folk, and art classical. I wonder, how much should personal preference for a student's favorite style inform the methods or the strategies that you think instructors should employ when they teach?
Yeah. Well, and I kind of wonder sometimes, as I wrote that chapter, I thought, okay, this feels like the most controversial or inflammatory thing I might be writing about right now, to try and put music in, it's like, don't put death metal in a box. I get to have people that are like, it's so much more technical than classical music. And I believe people. I just figure, you have to have some major targets, because it's really intimidating to just, to have the idea and say to either a child or a parent, like, you could play any song. What do you want to play? Like, that's like analysis paralysis to have all of those choices all the time.
Yeah.
So being able to create certain categories to help us process things, I think I think helps. And like I mentioned, that idea about folk type music has really grown with me in the past couple of years as I've spent more and more time with early childhood students and rediscovering that a little bit and rediscovering some of the value that they're not necessarily encountering a lot of that music in the culture of the world right now. And quite frankly, where I am, like music education, like within public schools and things like that, is very, very, very scaled back or non-existent. So they're also, in many cases, don't have like a general music teacher as well. So there's just so few opportunities to get exposed to that. So I think giving students, they don't know what they don't know. And so as a music teacher, being a little bit proactive to open up a few more doors to things they don't know, I think is a part of our role there. In a bigger sense, that whole, rock music, classical music is probably the big debate. I mean, maybe you and I, from our backgrounds, sit on opposite sides of the table historically on that controversy, so to speak. But I just don't think that there's a reason that you have to sit on one side or the other of that of that discussion.
Well, and honestly, in the spirit of why we started this podcast is, like, Mandy and I have completely different backgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, my kids have done Mandy's classes, Mandy's kids have done my classes, and we both understand that the concept of genre is it's I don't know, it's hard to describe, right? Because everything crosses over. Like, I've been a proponent on previous episodes of kind of saying, like, well, really, pop music is the new folk music, and it's everything crosses over. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals of what we're doing are literally exactly the same, right? Mm-hmm. We're all using the same notes. We're all generally playing in the same time signatures. Rhythmic value is the same. That stuff is universal. And even in like the popular genres, like you could say, like, well, country currently or country pop is like essentially the same as regular pop, but it's just the flavor of the instruments that they're using and the texture. So that's my long-winded answer of saying, while Michael, you and I may have come from different backgrounds, we're still doing the same thing. And if our goal is to figure out how we're to help students accomplish their goal, which is to play music, well, then, yeah, it's good to compartmentalize, but I think that in large part, if I'm understanding what you're saying, or at least how I'm looking at it, understanding from the student's perspective what they might perceive as these three primary genres is helpful to sort of hone in on what types of music or what songs we think might be effective in teaching them. And to leverage that information to then expand.
Right. I think, I think the concept of relatedness there when it comes to like that individual motivation is there, that if what you're learning relates, if you can connect it to something meaningful to you, no matter what that is, then you're going to have a reason to practice it besides, like, I'm going to get grounded if I don't do this right now, which is, not exactly the lifelong love of music that we're trying to inspire for people. But I think that's where the skill of the teacher can really come into play as well, too, because we do associate a lot of genres with certain like modalities, so to speak, like rock musicians don't read music and classical musicians don't play by ear. And none of those things have to be true. And if we're choosing, smartly, I think I see a lot of times, to fault my own camp, we have classically based teachers that are giving reading materials that are way too hard, but it's classical music. So like it has to be valid or it has to be good, instead of, actually looking and say, what amount of reading is developmentally appropriate for this student right now, no matter what genre it is. The fact that it's Mozart doesn't intrinsically make it like more wholesome to learn if it's the wrong thing at the wrong time.
I really liked the way that you talked about the genres in your book, Michael. And in early childhood, I use a whole lot of folk music too. And I really like the idea that I'm exposing kids to these different kinds of genres and like that I'm keeping these traditions alive. Like that kind of feels good. I don't know if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because we don't make music as much as we used to. And like you said, they're not in the general music class in elementary school and the public schools. So I like that. I love that the caregivers in my class recognize some of these songs from their childhood. So you do kind of see the passing on of this music. I don't teach private lessons, but I appreciate taking a student's interest and using that as a jumping off point. I love the idea of, if I'm a teacher that won't, pigeonhole myself in one genre and can appreciate the other genres, that I can take what my student is interested in as a jumping off point, but then use that to say, hey, if you really like this pop song, you might, maybe let's try this folk tune, right? Or do you know that this pop song samples this, Mozart tune? And to expand awareness in the kids too. I think that that's important as music teachers. I mean, I do folk songs in my classes, and then we get up and we have a dance party to John Baptiste. So
yeah,
I'm always encouraging my families to, like, there is no right answer. You don't need to be listening to kiddie music. Explore everything. So something for teachers to think about.
Yeah. And sometimes we can be real sneaky too. I mean, like, you don't even have to be that smart about it. I've got one little guy right now, and he just loves snakes. So I can teach him any skill I want. As if it has any connection to snakes, it doesn't matter what it is. I can teach it to him, and he's like, "Yes, I want to know that now." be sneaky. I don't care.
Perfect. Yeah, I love that. And that's
fantastic.
Yeah, as the teacher, being creative to find these things for your student. Perfect.
Yeah.
Love it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're like, we're going to learn about legato because look, this looks like a snake. Woohoo!
Yeah, yes. I would lean into that so hard, and I would start calling the lessons snake lessons, and just like all in on that. Love that.
Cool.
Michael, there was one other concept that you introduced in the book, and I was hoping that you would kind of explain this and expand on it a little bit. You talked about, well, to kind of set it up, Mandy and I have discussed the idea of reading music, and is reading music important, and when should you teach reading music, and how does that come into play? And I believe in your book, I think it's part of is that the natural learning sequence that you mentioned?
I think
imitation, ideation, or is that something else?
Yeah, I mean, it touches in several places there. There's a chapter called Strong Roots about eyes and ears and touch, that relates to different modalities there. And so I think that question comes up in a few different places. So it's a question about, so go ahead.
Well, I think, and again, there are so many concepts in the book that I loved, but I remember the reading music came last in a sequence of things to do, and maybe that's how from, like, in younger ages we start by listening and then imitating, and it's not until kind of the end of that sequence where it's reading. Is that correct?
Right. And I think that to take it to a different analogy, sometimes it's like we're taking people and we're pointing to the word cat, and we're trying to teach them to read cat, and we have not ever shown them what a cat is. So they have actually zero context, because they're like, I don't even know what a cat is. And that, like, you have to establish that before you ever establish that, then the different letters, and that letters make sounds. And there's so many stages that we do that, and we understand it a little bit better, I think, when it comes to things like reading, because it's so much more culturally prevalent that, we realize you can't just do nothing and then open the Cat in the Hat and just start reading. That, we read to children, we let them play with letter flashcards. There are all of these things that happen throughout early childhood in preparation for reading, and we see that a little bit more. But musically, it's like we start cold turkey from day one, and it's like, I'm going to show you a quarter note, before you've ever established the fact that, there's such a thing called a steady beat. And, a quarter note means nothing if you haven't ever experienced a beat.
Right. Yeah. Or if you don't know what it's a quarter of, if you don't know what it's a whole. Yeah. And I had a conversation with Tim Topham, and he really kind of opened my eyes to like, well, the idea of why in method books they start with reading right away and where that came from. And it's really kind of just this really old tradition where people started taking music lessons, and there were books because there wasn't any recordings to listen to. So because they used books to reproduce these, or printed music in books to reproduce music, well, then that just sort of stuck over time. And it's like, well, this is how we do it. We start with the reading. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I'm a huge fan of music reading. I mean, like, me personally, I am a stereotypical piano person, and it's like, give me 12 bookshelves of sheet music, that's my jam. And so I want that for my students too, because I do believe it's this gateway to things that otherwise, you might not know how to get into. And, there's analysis, there's a lot you can do there, but it's all in context. And so reading is a tool to get you where you want to go. It's not like an end all to itself.
Right.
You want to have something that you want to read. So if you learn to read and then there's nothing you want to read anymore, well, what did you accomplish?
Okay. Practical question, because that's a common, I believe, in that theme of educating the parents, that's a common question you get from parents in music schools or music studios and music lessons. Well, are they learning to read? Isn't that and the assumption is, well, that's the whole goal, is they should be able to read music. So how do you approach that with the parents that you speak with?
Sure. Well, I think, to back it up a little bit, I think that's one of the great values of that early childhood, kind of within the context of the stream of music, is that a lot of those precursor stages, those things that have to happen before reading, happens so well in early childhood phases. If you can build the concepts of high and low and up and down and using your singing voice and all of that stuff before you ever get to like the piano bench, then you're set up for success. So that, is really, I think, the ideal scenario, is building all of those pre-literacy phases into early childhood. But sometimes, that didn't happen. I didn't start like that. I definitely had different types of musical experiences in my background, but I didn't take any like formal music education and like lessons until I was like 10 or 11. So I wasn't, the 5-year-old in an early childhood music class or anything like that. But, if you get to 11 and you don't have that foundation necessarily, we just want to talk about those holistic senses, that we want to build reading on top of their other skills, and really to know the child as well too. That I think that reading music can be one of the most frustrating sticking points that turns a lot of people away. I think it's one of those things that when people quit and say they're not making enough progress, or like all those people that bounce after 4 months, I think frustration with music reading is probably a huge culprit there, because we're only setting up this one goal and they're failing at that one goal. So I think you have to be honest and say, they're really strong with memorizing songs, so we want to build on that strength, or these are other things that they're naturally really good at, and we want to further build those strong points, and give them some readings, like in my case, try and give them some reading skills along the way, even if it's not a primary focus. And I know that there's some philosophies that just kind of dismiss that altogether so that they can put even more focus on other areas. But for me, I would rather spend a majority of my time in the area where they're going to experience competence and success, whether that's reading or not reading, and then trying to strengthen the surrounding skills as a support there. And I think it goes the other way as well too, because improvisation is a huge musical skill. I think the ability to improvise is equally like freeing to an adult musician, like as a lifelong person, the same way that you can argue and say, hey, reading music is going to give you lots of like opportunities to participate in things independently as a musical person. Improvisation is also going to be like that. And we kind of tend to get one or the other. And I really, would encourage that it's more of both. And coming from that more classical tradition, 10 years ago, I would egg my 12-year-old piano students to try and improvise stuff, and they just look at me in terror like, what? What are you talking about? Just make it up. That's not what we do here. And so I had to learn to dial it way back and say, okay, wow, I definitely waited too long on this. I need to take my 7-year-olds that only know how to play C, D, and E and give them some structured opportunities to make up their own music too. I've got to see both things into their experiences along the way.
Yeah, I love that. Taking that kind of holistic approach to it. You mentioned that early childhood phase, and Mandy shared some great information on episode 37. Can early exposure to music enhance ability to learn? And I think everything that she shared in that episode speaks to what you were talking about as well. Michael, this has been fantastic. There's so much good information in your book. I'm actually on my second read right now, but I enjoyed it. I think there's a lot of, again, I know you wrote it for parents, but I think for instructors and studio owners to understand, I think they could get a ton from the book. How can people purchase this book from you?
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon in all print and ebook formats. We've got a link on our New Songs Music website as well too that will link you up to different places where you can get it as an audiobook as well. So those are continuing to upload and make their way through the internet sphere to be available in different venues as well too. Or if you happen to be in Central California and want to swing by any one of my schools, I'll be happy to hand you a copy there.
Awesome.
Great. Yeah. Mr. Michael's Music Maker Manual, A Parent's Guide to Growing Creative Children. Michael Hemsworth, thank you. Thanks for coming on the show. This was really, it was a pleasure to speak with you and hear about, there's just so much thought. I can tell that you've put into not just your teaching, but your studio and the book. And I think it's fantastic. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It's such a privilege to get to do what you're really, really passionate about doing. And so, I never take it for granted that it's really the best job in the world and such a privilege to be able to do it.
Love this. We will link to where people can purchase the book in the show notes. And on that, we're going to wrap this episode of Rock School Proprietor Podcast, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, guys.
A huge thank you again to Michael Hemsworth for joining us on the podcast. Such great information from Michael. His book again, Mr. Michael's Music Maker Manual, A Parent's Guide to Growing Creative Children, is available on Amazon. We'll link to that in the show note. If you have topic suggestions or questions, info@rockschoolproprietor.com is where you can reach us. We always love to hear from our listeners. We've put together free resources for teachers and studio owners over at rockschoolproprietor.com. So visit us over there. On social, I'm at rock.school.proprietor on Instagram, and John Kazicki on both LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Ratings and reviews are super important to us, so please help us out on Apple Podcast and Spotify. We'd really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode and gained insight from our conversation, then we count that as a win. As always, all we ask in return is that you pay it forward. Please share the show with someone you think needs to hear it.